Hi everyone, my name is Aoife Delargy-Lowe and I serve as the Director of Law School Engagement and Advocacy at Equal Justice Works. We're absolutely delighted that you were able to join us for another installment of My Impact. This time we're talking to Erica Briant, a 2014 Equal Justice Works Fellow. We're here to talk about Equal Justice Works Fellowships, how this launched Erica's career, and hopefully inspire some law students to pursue a career in public interest law. So Erica, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so delighted you were able to make the time to chat with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's start from the beginning. Why public service? Why law school?
Great question. It's always hard to know exactly how far back to go. So I'll try and give enough context, but not bore everyone to tears. So I was raised by a single mom in a very working class community. And so I think that need for equal access to justice was instilled in me through personal experience from a very young age. And then I came of age around the time of the Iraq War, and I was also involved in my school's LGBT rights organizations. So all these things, both from the very personal level to the worldwide level, sort of convinced me that I wanted to be involved in trying to affect change through my career. And then as a college student, I was a history major and I wasn't really thinking about law school, but I ended up studying a lot about social change and social movements. And I thought that I could better sustain myself throughout, decades-long career if I had some more concrete skills. I was thinking about social work or policy advocacy, and I found that because I'm very interpersonally motivated, I've really got a lot out of working with individual clients. So I thought, maybe law. And then, just in case I was wrong, I went and joined the Peace Corps, and I served as a Peace Corps volunteer doing public health around HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, in Eswatini. And I was totally prepared for that to change my perspective completely, for me to think that I wanted to do, international development or public health as a career. But instead, I just kept coming back to civil rights and equal access to justice and wanting that concrete impact that you have the potential to have as an attorney. So I came back, and after a year as a community organizer, I went to law school.
That's such a great story. Thanks so much for sharing that. So you're now in law school. How do you hear about Equal Justice Works? How do you hear about the fellowship opportunity?
Sure. So, I went to law school thinking, I wanted to do public interest work, but I think like many law students, not a whole lot of detailed information about what that landscape looks like, how broad the set of opportunities are. And so, once I got there, you go to career services events and you go to career panels and you talk to your professors who seem like they're there to listen to you and your colleagues and friends and all of that. And Equal Justice Works was just clearly a leader in the public interest field. It was obvious that that was the way to start a successful career in public service. I was fortunate to be connected through my local school and city chapter of the National Lawyers Guild to connect with a couple of currently serving Equal Justice Works fellows and learn about their fellowship. And then I went to the Equal Justice Works conference looking for summer jobs. So I had all of these multiple little points of connection with Equal Justice Works, and they were all really great. So, by the time it came to be spring of my second year of law school, I started thinking about, potential organizations who I could work with to submit a fellowship application. And I was very clear that, I would want to be sponsored to apply for Equal Justice Works, and that was the ideal spot for me. Although, of course, I applied for any source of funding I could possibly apply for.
That's really great. So your host organization was the Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about that host organization. What was the process like of applying for the fellowship? And tell us about those 2 years. What was really memorable about that?
So Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania serves the 4 suburban counties that surround Philadelphia. So for anyone from the area, that's Bucks County, Chester County, Delaware County, and Montgomery County. And it's a really interesting, diverse geographic area because there are areas of incredible concentrated poverty, areas of incredible concentrated wealth, not a lot of access to services. And unlike in Philadelphia, there is really only one major civil legal service provider, and that is Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania. So, I started thinking, having done most of my internships and pro bono activities as a law student in Philly, I was really used to there being dozens of organizations. And so if my organization didn't provide something, I could figure out who did and make the referral, and even as a student develop relationships to try and make sure it was a warm referral and have confidence that the client would get the help that they needed. And Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania is trying to do all of that and more. And it's the challenge of my life to try and make sure that we're able to meet the need as much as possible. So part of what was so exciting about the fellowship, which the mission of the fellowship was to remove barriers to employment, largely by looking at the collateral consequences of criminal records. So that's the mission, and it was very exciting because that was largely new work to Legal Aid. And so, the organization had identified the need, had gone out, we looked for the funding, we got the funding, and we were able to try and service those clients who desperately needed the assistance and deserved it, to break the cycle of, poverty and incarceration and combat the racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. But it was a steep learning curve, right? So I came in really not very familiar with the geographic area of the suburban counties, not having relationships with other service providers. We hadn't been doing a lot of outreach on this issue because it wasn't something we had the capacity to handle a lot of these cases before I started as a fellow. So it was simultaneously extremely exciting and a little bit intimidating, right? I mean, I think I was 29, and I was a brand new lawyer. I hadn't even gotten my bar results yet when I started. I was actually teaching a continuing legal education class before I was barred. So that's how fast it went. That was a lot. I do feel like I was able to draw upon some of my experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer and as a community organizer in the US as well, to try and figure out, who were the other players and start to build those relationships and learn and listen to them and let it be as much as possible, led by folks who are directly impacted in a way that I'm not, right? I was brand new to the area. So it took, months and months to sort of get that together and get that going, get myself trained so that I could provide competent legal services. And then very quickly, it became clear that even with the extra capacity that I created, it was not nearly enough to meet the demand. So then, like the good community organizer that I am, I started to think about how to leverage volunteers, how to recruit and train, law students and community college students, so that they could help with the work, as well as helping them get meaningful, important experience through the process, so that we could serve absolutely as many folks as possible.
So you mentioned several times that, you were a community organizer before you came to law school. Would you consider yourself a community lawyer?
I hope so. That's the goal to which I aspire. But I think if you give yourself that title, it's a lot to live up to. So I approach it with caution. But that's the goal. I mean, I will never know where the resources are needed as well as someone who's lived through things that I have not. So I try and let the community drive that as much as possible.
Do you have any memorable stories about those 2 years or a case that was really memorable during that time?
I have like 175, but I will try and give you two, if that's all right. And if I talk too long, holler at me. So my first one is my favorite because I actually just got to talk to him again recently. So this was a client who had a criminal record he had 2 citations. They were both extremely minimal from when he was, 18, 19, something like that. And in fact, I think both of the charges were dismissed. So he was never convicted of anything. And what he had been charged with initially was the lowest type of criminal record in Pennsylvania. So most states have felonies and misdemeanors. Pennsylvania also has a summary, which is below a misdemeanor. People call them citations. You could actually mail in a guilty plea and end up with a criminal conviction without ever having seen the inside of a courtroom. So it was this type of extremely low level record. And then he was graduating from college, and he had been provisionally admitted to medical school, but his medical school was insisting upon a hearing because of his criminal record to see if they should continue to honor his admission. So we worked together to clear the criminal record and, got everything expunged. It's such a low level thing from a number of years ago. It's certainly the type of thing that can be expunged. And then I was also able to advocate for him at the hearing before the admission council, and he was admitted. And then I just recently heard from him because he was actually starting his residency, and he was getting his credentials early so that he could help treat COVID-19 patients.
Wow, that's such an amazing story. That's so fantastic. That's great that you got to connect with him.
Yeah, so he was like, how do I answer these credentialing questions? Do I have to talk about this record we expunged years ago? But it was just so lovely for me to know that, because we were able to clear up the record, his whole life is going to be different than it would have been had he not. And, of course, everyone is better served when we've got more qualified, compassionate doctors. So that was really lovely and rewarding to hear back from him, especially around this uncertain time. Do I have enough time to tell a second one?
Of course, you can tell as many as you'd like.
Thank you. So this one's a little bit more complicated. Part of my fellowship, besides doing expungements, we would also work with clients who had been indicated by a social worker for having perpetrated some kind of child abuse or neglect. And that indication, it's just as simple as checking a box on a form. And if that box is checked, then before you get a chance for a hearing or any opportunity for representation or argument, if you don't appeal to set that in motion for the entire rest of your life, you are prohibited from working in any healthcare field with children, in schools, in hospitals, all of these professions which have real upward mobility for low-income folks, and especially low-income women. It's really a major employer for a lot of my clients. So I had this client who was working in a daycare, and she was also a certified nursing assistant. So all of her experience was going to be directly impacted by this indication. And a little boy got a hold of her travel mug of tea, which she was allowed to have. The travel mug, it has that nicely fitting lid, right? It's, I'm sure all of us with kids use the travel mug and feel good, like we're doing the responsible thing by having it covered. But you turn him back for a second and the little boy got a hold of the mug and pulled it down on himself, and he was burnt, and he's fine, right? He recovered, everybody's all right. But as a result of that, she was indicated for child abuse. And while that's a tragedy, and I feel terrible for what the child and his family went through, I don't think it means she's untrustworthy in a caregiving capacity, right? I mean, I would hire her as babysitter. She was a lovely person. And I think it's so tempting, and we're all so tempted when something tragic happens. It's a relief to be able to point the finger, to say, well, that happened because of that person and that person's bad actions, not because the universe tends toward entropy, not because there are things outside my control. That's a scary thing to accept, right? But unfortunately, while it's comforting for all of us to be able to do that, it's not accurate, and it's certainly not fair to her. So we were able to have a hearing, and the judge agreed that while that was an accident, she really hadn't done anything. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had done everything to try and mitigate the risk. She had followed every single one of the employment handbook requirements. I mean, she got the hot water from the employee kitchen, for goodness sake. And so being able to get rid of that so that she could go on to continue to be a caregiver, which is what she had done and what she loved and what she was good at, for the rest of her career and support her own 2 children as a single mom was very relieving. I mean, I wouldn't even say gratifying because it was this tremendous wrong she should have never had to suffer through in the first place. But goodness, I'm glad for the fellowship and the resources it created that we could get her out of that.
That's another amazing story of what one attorney can do in terms of the impact you can have on another person's life. So thanks so much for sharing that story. So you're still at Legal Aid. You finished your fellowship in 2016. What was that transition like, moving out of the fellowship and remaining there, and what have you learned along the way?
Sure. It's been a great privilege to get to stay at Legal Aid. I really love it. Great colleagues and the relationships that I built with the community. I'm very happy to get to continue to work in that space. When my fellowship was getting close to ending, maybe in the last year of a 2-year fellowship, we were having conversations about how the organization might continue to have a spot for me. I was, sort of checking in periodically, making it clear that they knew that I wanted to stay. Budgets are always in flux and grants are getting submitted all the time. So I was, chatting with the development director, chatting with the deputy director and the executive director, as well as my managing attorney, just to sort of keep that conversation going. And I was extremely fortunate. So my partner was applying for residency, and we were trying to decide if we wanted to, prioritize staying in the area or if the whole country was an option. And so my organization was able to commit to me that I would get to stay on as a staff attorney so that we as a family could figure out where we wanted to prioritize residency options. So that was rare, but I'm so grateful. And then it ended up being that one of our staff attorneys actually retired only a few months after my fellowship ended. And so, in his retirement, he was very clear and transparent about the fact that that was happening, that was in the works. So my organization really only needed to come up with enough funding to cover the maybe 3 or 4 month gap between when my fellowship ended and when he retired. So I was able to stay on seamlessly. My portfolio did change a little bit. So, we actually had a new fellow who I was helping to train, who took over some of the expungement cases. And then I took on some bankruptcy cases because that was the position for the person who retired. But then after 1 year, that fellowship ended and we were able to get some different funding for collateral consequences work. And so I was able to pick that back up as my full-time gig, which I'm so happy about. I love it so much. And then just maybe 6 months ago, we were able to get some extra funding to create a community engagement unit, which I now supervise, which handles the collateral consequences of criminal records work, as well as name changes and these child line cases I was mentioning, everything I did as a fellow. And in addition, we have a few other attorneys with different portfolios, but what unites us is this, community-based model that we were talking about. So been able to sort of leverage the community partnerships that I started building 5.5 years ago at this point, almost 6 years ago, to really expand and grow. We're actually looking to get into immigration. We're growing like gangbusters. And I mean, I don't know that any of it would be happening now if we hadn't had that, seed money for the fellowship through Equal Justice Works. And I can't imagine what my own career would look like. I'm sure it would be something completely different.
That's so great to hear how you guys are expanding and thinking about how you can extend your services to other areas like immigration. That's really fantastic. So how was it working alongside another fellow when you mentioned you had a fellow come in and take over a part of your portfolio that you've been working on? What was that like?
Oh, it was really fun. So one of the requirements of my Equal Justice Works Fellowship was that I work with interns. So I started working with law student interns from when I had been only, I think I started at Legal Aid in September, and I think by January I had my first law student intern. And I had generally at least 1 or 2 interns every semester or summer throughout the whole remainder of my 2-year fellowship. So I was used to onboarding new folks and training them from scratch, fortunately. So it was just great fun to be able to do that. And it was easier to do that with someone who was around full time and already had the experience under their belt of, you know, a series of public interest internships and pro bono experience before graduating law school. So it was great fun. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, you've talked about the fact that you've had interns and you supervise law students. So you've got a really great perspective in that, you know, right now we're living in an unprecedented time. Do you have any advice for law students that are really passionate about public interest law and do want to pursue it, given, you know, everything that's going on? Are there things that you think are really important to keep in mind and think about as they launch their public interest career?
I mean, I'm sure the more people you talk to, the more different pieces of advice you'll get. So I'll try not to pile on too much. I'll say when I'm looking at law students or at recent graduated attorneys with thinking about whether I'm going to hire someone for an internship or for as a staff attorney, or even who we'd like to sponsor as an organization for fellowships, I'm looking for experience that is transferable in terms of skills, which doesn't necessarily mean I'm looking for someone who's done an expungement before, but I'm looking for someone who has worked with similar clients or clients facing similar challenges, because I can teach you how to do an expungement. But if you don't have the compassion and the drive to do poverty law, I think it would be very easy to get burnt out. I also understand that not everybody can afford to take an unpaid internship, right? That's a real challenge. So I personally always require that people submit a cover letter because I want them to have an opportunity to tell me about stuff that's not going to show up on their resume, whether it's their background, you know, their diversity, the origin of their passion for the work, whatever that is, or even, you know, maybe something on the resume might not look like it's going to have transferable skills. I want them to be able to tell me that they are transferable skills. So I would say the one thing is, even if you don't have experience that seems on the nose relevant, I would urge you to explain how the skills are transferable in a cover letter. Also, I'm a big fan of informational interviews. I think a lot of times people are really nervous or intimidated to reach out. I'll say at least my local, you know, Southeastern Pennsylvania, Philly area public interest legal community is extremely welcoming. Dozens of attorneys took the time to talk to me as a law student about their jobs. Honestly, now that I'm a lawyer, that is flattering, right? For someone to come to me and say that they are interested in what I do. It's a pleasure. So one, I love doing that with students. And two, I would encourage, even if it's through Zoom while we're not in the office physically, I would absolutely encourage students to reach out. The other thing is that everything's in flux right now. So if you thought you had a summer internship and now suddenly you don't, think creatively about how you can still contribute and how you can still get that experience, because not only is that going to look good because it'll be a thing on your resume, but also the fact that you are a creative problem solver with some grit, those are all transferable skills to legal services. So even if it is part-time research assistant or you know, a couple hours a week staffing telephone intake calls remotely, even if it's something small, just the action of you reaching out and trying to initiate that is almost certainly going to bear fruit, because even if the organization doesn't have a spot for you now, they might have something for you in the fall or the spring, or you might just then end up having one of those informational interviews to talk to them about what they do. So reaching out, I think, is the number one piece of advice.
That's really good advice, Erica. It was really pragmatic. I really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot from this conversation, so thank you so much for doing this. And thank you for all of your work and the amazing impact that you're having on the clients in Pennsylvania. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I'll say, you know, to anyone who's watching this, if you're interested in reaching out, in talking more, whether you're based in Philly or California, I am happy to be a resource. I have to pay it forward for all of those attorneys who helped guide me in the right direction. So don't hesitate to reach out, right? My email address is ebriant@lasp.org. Shoot me an email. Tell me you want to talk. I'd be happy to take the time.